A grizzly bear approached a girl in a wheelchair, and what happened next left everyone speechless. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The afternoon sunlight dappled through the towering trees of Yellowstone National Park, casting a golden glow on the peaceful landscape. Families gathered along the trails, the sound of children's laughter blending with the rustling of leaves. It was the kind of day where worries seemed to melt away, where the vastness of nature reminded people of its beauty and power. But then, something changed. A hush fell over the clearing as a shadow moved at the edge of the forest. The laughter died down, replaced by murmurs of confusion, then fear. A massive grizzly bear had emerged from the trees, its thick golden-brown fur rippling with each slow, deliberate step. It wasn't roaring. It was simply watching. And it wasn't watching the crowd. It was heading straight for a girl sitting alone in a wheelchair. A moment frozen in time. Eleanor Whitman, 14 years old, had always loved the outdoors. Since an accident had left her in a wheelchair 2 years prior, nature had become her sanctuary, a place where she didn't feel limited, where she could lose herself in the endless sky and whispering trees. Her parents, John and Margaret, had brought her to Yellowstone every summer, determined that nothing, not even tragedy, would take away her love for adventure. That afternoon, Eleanor had found the perfect spot near a quiet clearing. Her parents were just a few steps away, speaking with a park ranger about a nearby trail. Beside her, her loyal golden retriever, Oliver, lay resting, his soft fur warm against her leg. With a sketchbook balanced on her lap, she had been lost in drawing a family of elk grazing in the distance, until Oliver suddenly lifted his head, his ears stiffening. A low whimper escaped his throat. Eleanor followed his gaze toward the trees. At first, she saw nothing, only shadows moving with the wind. But then, something enormous stepped forward. The grizzly. Her breath caught. The bear moved in eerie silence, its large paws pressing into the soft earth without a sound. Its powerful shoulders shifted with every step, muscles rippling beneath its thick fur. But it wasn't just the bear's size that sent a chill through Eleanor. It was its eyes. They weren't wild with hunger or aggression. They were focused. Calm. Focused on her. A mother's worst fear. Gasps spread through the crowd as people instinctively took steps back. A mother pulled her child close. A father grabbed his son's arm. The ranger tensed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody move!" Eleanor's mother turned, her face going pale. "Eleanor!" The bear was now only 20 feet away. "Don't move." The ranger urged again, his hand gripping John's arm before he could run toward his daughter. "If we startle it, it could charge." "But that's my child!" Margaret's voice was nearly a sob. The ranger's jaw tightened. "I know, but trust me, running will make it worse." Terror gripped Eleanor's chest, but something deep inside told her to stay still. The bear's gaze was unwavering but not hostile. It was curious. The massive creature took another step forward. 15 feet. Oliver whined but did not bark, his instincts keeping him frozen. The grizzly let out a soft huff, its breath visible in the crisp air. Then it did something that made the ranger's eyes widen in disbelief. It lowered its massive head. An unbelievable connection. The crowd remained frozen, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. The bear, this wild, untamed force of nature, was now just 10 feet from Eleanor. But instead of aggression, it moved with an almost gentle presence. Eleanor, heart pounding, felt something shift inside her. Slowly, she lifted a trembling hand from her lap, palm facing upward. A small gesture. An offering of trust. The bear sniffed the air again, then stepped even closer. 5 feet. The ranger whispered something under his breath, as if praying. The bear let out a deep, rumbling sound. Not a growl, but something softer. It extended its massive nose forward, inching toward Eleanor's outstretched hand. For a moment the world held its breath, and then the bear pressed its nose gently against Eleanor's palm. A collective gasp rippled through the onlooker. Eleanor felt warmth, rough fur, the humid breath of a creature that could crush her in an instant, yet chose not to. Instead, the bear lingered. Eleanor swallowed hard. She could feel something unspoken passing between them. Something beyond words. Did it sense her vulnerability? Did it recognize something familiar in her? As if they were both creatures who had faced struggles they hadn't chosen? Her fingers lightly brushed the bear's fur. Then, as suddenly as it had approached, the bear pulled away. It let out another soft huff, gave Eleanor one last, lingering look, then turned, and walked back into the trees. The aftermath. For a long moment, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. Margaret ran to Eleanor, tears spilling down her face as she held her daughter tightly. "Are you okay? Oh my God, are you okay?" John exhaled sharply, gripping the ranger's arm. "What just happened?" The ranger shook his head, still staring at the empty clearing where the bear had disappeared. "I don't know," he admitted. "But in all my years working with wildlife, I've never seen anything like it." A lesson in the unexpected, the story spread. Some called it a miracle, others a once-in-a-lifetime event. Wildlife experts debated whether the bear had been drawn to Eleanor's stillness, sensing something different about her. Some believed it was mere curiosity. Others said it was something more, an unspoken bond between two beings who had learned to navigate a world that often underestimated them. As for Eleanor, she would never forget that moment. Not because she had been afraid, but because in that moment she had felt truly seen. The wilderness had always been where she felt free, and now, in the eyes of a grizzly bear, she had found a connection that defied explanation. Even years later, when she told the story, people would ask the same question, "Weren't you scared?" And she would always smile and say the same thing. "No, because I don't think he meant to hurt me. I think he just wanted me to know I belonged here too." The grizzly that stopped for a girl in a wheelchair and changed everything. The clearing had gone eerily silent, as if the world itself had paused to witness the impossible. Eleanor Whitman sat frozen in her wheelchair, her breath shallow, her heart pounding. The massive grizzly stood just feet away, watching her with dark, intelligent eyes. Not with menace, not with hunger, but with it. Didn't grizzlies were unpredictable, dangerous. Everyone knew that. But this one, it wasn't charging. It wasn't retreating. It was just standing there, its great head slightly lowered, its gaze locked onto hers. Eleanor's golden retriever, Oliver, trembled beside her but didn't bark. His instincts, usually sharp, had guided him to silence. Behind her, she could hear her mother, Margaret, trying to stifle a sob. Her father, John, muttering prayers under his breath. And beyond them, the gathered visitors, whispering, "Fie!" But Eleanor didn't see any. Oh, she saw only the bear. And something inside her whispered, "Don't be afraid." A connection beyond words. Her fingers trembled as she slowly lifted her hand, palm up. A small, hesitant gesture. Not an act of defiance, not an act of defiance, not an act. The bear exhaled, a deep, slow breath that misted in the crisp afternoon air. Its ears twitched at the sound of her voice when she whispered, She didn't know if the grizzly took a single St. Margaret gasped. But Eleanor W. Tears welled in. It was fleeting yet profound. This strange, impossible con. "Ne'er you lost?" She doubled. The bear's ears flicked again. For the briefest moment, it lowered its head even further, almost a bow. The then just as, and then it was gone. She wasn't sure if the moment had been real or if she had only imagined the emotions in the bear's eyes. But she couldn't shake the thought. That bear had looked at her with something more than curiosity. "Leaving the moment behind. We're leaving," John said firmly. His hands gripping the Oliver trotted alongside her. "Tail wag? But what Margaret place? Honey, we need to get you somewhere safe." "That bear, we wild. We can take any chances." Eleanor didn't argue, but she couldn't let go of the feeling that the bear hadn't meant any harm. It had approached her, stopped, and left. No growling, no aggression. Why? As they reached the Mr. and Mrs. Whitman, "She's but I don't think the bear was going the Ethan Crouch bear. Especially Grizz." "But it wasn't," Eleanor insisted. Her voice was steady. "It looked at me like it knew. Like it was sad." Ethan hesitated. Studying her, he had spent years working in the P. It didn't act like John let out a breath and ran a hand down his face. "So what?" No, Ethan glanced back toward the trees. "Still no," he said slowly. Eleanor looked up. "Do you think Ethan didn't answer right? If, as they somewhere in the endless expanse of and deep down, she knew. This wasn't the end. The sun dipped lower over the towering evergreens, casting long shadows across the Alna meadow. Eleanor Whitman sat in her wheelchair, her pencil hovering above the page, as she listened to the sudden hush that had fallen over the forest. Max, her golden retriever, lifted his head, ears pricked, his body tense. Eleanor swallowed, glancing toward her parents. Margaret and John were a few feet away, laughing softly over something in their packed picnic basket. Unaware of the change in the air, but Eleanor felt it. It was the same feeling she'd had the day before when the bear approached her. The same silent pull, like an invisible thread connecting her to something unseen. Her gaze drifted toward the trees, and then, there it was. A shadow moved between the trunks, a large, familiar shape stepping cautiously into the meadow's edge. Her heart stopped. The bear had returned. A moment suspended in time, Eleanor sucked in a sharp breath as the grizzly moved closer, its massive frame shifting effortlessly through the tall grass. The sunlight caught the thick fur on its back, illuminating the golden-brown hues. Max whined but didn't bark. He remembered. The bear's dark eyes locked onto Eleanor. Not her parents. Not the food laid out on the picnic blanket. Just her. Margaret turned, gasping as she clutched John's arm. "John!" she whispered, her voice laced with panic. John was already standing, his body tense, ready to act. "Eleanor," he said in a low, careful tone. "Don't move." But Eleanor couldn't move, not from fear, but from something else entirely. The bear wasn't threatening her. It wasn't charging. It was waiting. An unspoken understanding slowly, deliberately. Eleanor extended her hand, just as she had the day before. The grizzly exhaled, nostrils flaring as it took another step forward. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "Eleanor." "Shh," Eleanor whispered. She kept her voice calm, steady. She wasn't sure why, but she wasn't afraid. The bear lowered its great head slightly, its ears flicking forward as if listening to her heartbeat. And then she knew. It hadn't just stumbled upon them by accident. It had sought her out. Why? A thought came unbidden. "Is it trying to tell me something?" Eleanor barely noticed as John moved, standing in front of Margaret protectively. The ranger, Ethan Harper, appeared at the far edge of the meadow, drawn by the hushed whispers of the other park visitors who had begun retreating. But he didn't interfere. He watched, just like the bear. A silent farewell. Eleanor let out a slow, controlled breath. "Are you lost?" she whispered. The bear blinked. And for the second time in 2 days it did something that sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. It lowered its head, not in aggression, not in submission. Like a bow. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the onlookers. Eleanor's fingers curled around the arms of her wheelchair as her chest tightened with an emotion she couldn't quite name. She thought she saw something in the bear's gaze, something ancient, tired, sad. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the bear turned. It walked back toward the trees, slow and steady, its powerful shoulders rippling beneath thick fur. At the edge of the clearing, it paused, looking back one last time. Then it was gone. The questions that remained, the silence in the meadow, stretched long after the bear had disappeared. Then, in a rush of motion, Margaret and John were at Eleanor's side, gripping her shoulders, touching her face, making sure she was unharmed. "Oh my God!" Margaret choked, running a hand through Eleanor's hair. "Are you all right?" "Hey!" Eleanor's voice caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say. Ethan Harper approached cautiously, his expression unreadable. "I've been working in this park for a decade," he said, shaking his head. Shouldn't have happened." John exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands over his face. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered. "First yesterday, now this." Margaret turned back to Eleanor. "Sweetheart, why did it come back?" Eleanor swallowed. She wished she had an answer. Instead, she glanced down at her lap, where her unfinished sketch lay. Without realizing it, her hands had begun sketching again, pencil gliding over paper as if guided by instinct. And there, forming on the page, was the bear, standing at the tree line, looking at her, watching. She didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But deep down, she felt it in her bones. This wasn't the end of the story. Somewhere, out in the vast, endless wilderness, the bear was still waiting. And one day, somehow, she would find it again. The message in the forest, the golden light of the mid-morning sun, bathed the meadow in warmth. But Eleanor Whitman felt a chill rise in her chest as she gazed at the tree line. The forest stood still, watching her, waiting. Her fingers tightened on the arms of her wheelchair as her heart beat in quiet anticipation. She wasn't sure what she expected. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Beside her, Max let out a soft whine, his ears twitching. He could feel it too. The bear was near. She wasn't sure how she knew. She just did. Margaret and John sat on the picnic blanket, chatting in low voices as they unpacked lunch. They kept a watchful eye on their daughter, but they didn't sense the shift in the air, the stillness that came before something important. But Eleanor did. A silent return, and then, there it was. The familiar golden-brown shape emerged from the trees, stepping onto the edge of the clearing with the same slow, deliberate grace as before. It was him, the Grizzly. It didn't charge. It didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, looking at her. Max whined again but didn't bark. Eleanor placed a steadying hand on his head. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to pause. Eleanor felt her breath hitch. She had spent hours replaying their first encounter, questioning whether she had imagined the weight of the bear's gaze, the quiet understanding in its dark eyes. But seeing him now, watching her, waiting, she knew this was real. And more than that, it meant something. "Mom," she called softly. Margaret turned, following Eleanor's gaze. The second she saw the bear, her face drained of color. "John," she gasped, scrambling to her feet. John was already moving, stepping in front of Eleanor as if he could shield her from the massive creature. "Stay calm," he murmured, his voice tight with fear. No sudden movements, but Eleanor didn't feel fear. She felt something else, something she couldn't put into words. The bear held its ground, watching her with those deep, knowing eyes. It wanted her to understand something. But what? The choice to follow before she could even think, Eleanor found herself wheeling forward. John reacted instantly. "Eleanor, no, wait," she whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "Just wait." The bear remained still. It didn't back away. It didn't advance. It was waiting for her. Margaret clutched John's arm, eyes wide with terror. "Eleanor, please." But Eleanor wasn't afraid. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the small flecks of lighter fur in the bear's coat, close enough to hear the slow, deep breaths it took. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her sketchbook, flipping to the page where she had drawn him the night before. She held it up, showing him his own image. The bear's ears flicked forward. His gaze lingered on the drawing. And then, something extraordinary happened. The grizzly let out a long, low huff, a sound neither aggressive nor fearful, a greeting. The sound rumbled through the clearing, deep and ancient, sending a shiver down Eleanor's spine. Her breath came in uneven gasps as she whispered, "What do you want me to know?" The bear lifted his massive head, then turned, walking toward the trees, but he didn't disappear. He stopped at the tree line and looked back, waiting. Inviting. A choice lay before her. Stay, and let the moment slip away, or follow, and find out why the bear had come back for her. The moment of truth. Eleanor's heart pounded as she wheeled forward again, her breath catching as Max padded beside her. But before she could move more than a few feet, John stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Eleanor," he said, voice firm but shaking, "this has gone far enough." Margaret rushed to her side, kneeling in front of her chair. "Sweetheart, I know this feels special to you, but it's still a wild animal. We can't risk you getting hurt." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, but she stopped. She saw the fear in their eyes, the helpless terror of parents who had spent years protecting their daughter, trying to shield her from a world that could be cruel and unpredictable. How could she explain to them what she felt? That this bear wasn't a threat, that he had come back for her, that this wasn't just coincidence, it was something bigger. But they wouldn't understand, not yet. Her hands tightened around the arms of her wheelchair as she exhaled shakily. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay," she whispered. John and Margaret visibly relaxed. Ethan Harper, the ranger, had appeared nearby, drawn by the murmurs of onlookers who had once again witnessed something inexplicable. He kept his distance, eyes sharp as he watched the bear. Slowly, the grizzly turned back toward the trees. It stood there for a long moment, watching her. And then, it was gone. The mystery remains. That night, Eleanor sat by the window of the cabin, staring out at the forest, waiting, wondering. The weight of the bear's gaze still lingered in her mind. She flipped open her sketchbook and began to draw, her pencil moving as if guided by something unseen. The bear, the trees, the way he had looked at her, as if she mattered, as if she had a role to play in something she didn't yet understand. Max sighed beside her, resting his head on her lap. Somewhere in the distance, deep in the forest, she thought she heard a familiar huff, soft, echoing, calling, a promise. This wasn't over. The bear's message. Eleanor Whitman sat stiffly in her wheelchair, her hands gripping the edges of her sketchbook. Across from her, Margaret and John exchanged uneasy glances, their worry thick in the air. Outside, the night had settled over the forest, its shadows stretching long beneath the moonlight. Max lay at her feet, his tail flicking slightly as if sensing the tension in the room. Margaret exhaled, steadying herself. "Eleanor, we need to understand what's happening with you and this bear." Eleanor's fingers tightened. She had expected this conversation ever since they'd left the meadow. Her mother's tone was cautious, but edged with something else. Fear. Her father, always the rational one, looked more exhausted than anything, like he was trying to make sense of something impossible. She looked down at the latest sketch of the bear. Every stroke captured the quiet strength in its eyes, the intelligence, the familiarity. She didn't know how to explain it to them in a way that wouldn't sound ridiculous. "I don't know how to put it into words," Eleanor finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't think the bear just found me. I think it's looking for me." Margaret inhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Eleanor, it's a wild animal. Animals don't look for people. Maybe it's been near humans before, maybe it's curious, but this isn't safe." John leaned forward, rubbing a hand down his face. "You know we trust you, sweetheart. But this isn't normal behavior for a grizzly, and for you to keep going back to it, acting like it's meant to be with you." "Because it is," Eleanor snapped, frustration flaring in her chest. "You went there not really. You didn't see it the way I did. It didn't want to hurt me. It was communicating." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "Even if that's true, what if it's dangerous? What if it doesn't understand the limits between curiosity and instinct?" "You can't predict what it will do next," Eleanor wanted to argue, but she hesitated. Deep down, she didn't know what the bear would do next. But she felt something pulling her toward it, an unshakable certainty that this wasn't over. She swallowed hard, staring at her parents. "I just need to see it one more time." John let out a low groan. "Eleanor, I have to," she insisted. "I have to understand." Margaret and John didn't reply right away. The weight of her words sat between them, filling the room with an uneasy silence. Finally, Margaret let out a shaky breath. "If you see it again, you don't go alone," she said. "We all go." "Agreed." Eleanor hesitated, but nodded. It was the best she could get. A final encounter the next day. The family returned to the meadow under the soft light of the morning sun. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, her fingers gripping the arms of her wheelchair as she scanned the tree line, waiting, hoping. They lingered for nearly an hour. Her parents sat a short distance away, chatting in hushed voices, trying to appear relaxed. Max, sensing Eleanor's anticipation, sat at her feet, his gaze locked on the forest. And then, movement, a slow rustling of branches, the faintest crunch of underbrush. Eleanor held her breath. The bear emerged. It was just as she remembered. Strong, golden brown, eyes deep and unreadable. It stepped forward, its massive paws pressing into the earth with deliberate slowness. John tensed beside her. "Eleanor," he whispered in warning, but she barely heard him. The bear stopped a few feet away, watching her. It was waiting. Margaret's hand hovered near Eleanor's wheelchair handle, but she didn't move. She was afraid, but she saw something now. The bear wasn't aggressive. It wasn't stalking. It was present. Eleanor inhaled sharply and lifted her hand, not to touch, just to show openness. And then the bear did something that stole the breath from every person in that meadow. It lowered its head, not in a show of dominance, not in preparation to attack, but in something that almost looked like a bow. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. John exhaled sharply. Eleanor's chest tightened. She felt the answer to a question she hadn't even known to ask. The bear knew her. It turned, padding a few steps toward the forest before stopping again. It was inviting her. Eleanor's fingers twitched on her lap. She didn't need to follow it to understand what it was telling her. It was time to let go. The message wasn't about her. It wasn't about them. It was about trust. Eleanor let out a trembling breath. The bear held her gaze for a long, quiet moment. Then, just as it had before, it turned and disappeared into the trees. Understanding the unspoken, the meadow was silent except for the distant call of a bird overhead. Margaret and John looked at Eleanor, their faces unreadable. The tension, the fear, it was still there, but something else had replaced it too. A quiet understanding. They may not have fully grasped what had happened, but they had seen it with their own eyes. Eleanor closed her sketchbook, her fingers lingering over the cover. She would see the bear again. Maybe not in this forest, maybe not even in this lifetime, but the connection they shared, that was forever. Max leaned against her leg, sensing her change in energy. She ran a hand over his soft fur and exhaled, a small smile pulling at the edges of her lips. "Come on," she said finally, turning back toward her parents. "We can go home now." A memory in the wild Eleanor Whitman sat in stunned silence, her parents' words echoing in her mind. A part of her had always felt drawn to the wilderness, but she never imagined there might be a reason, one tied to her earliest days. The idea that the bear might remember her, that it had seen her before when she was just a baby, sent chills down her spine. Could it be possible? Could an animal carry such a memory across the years? She spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, her thoughts tangled. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the bear, standing in the meadow, watching her with those deep, knowing eyes. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something more, something unspoken. Eleanor knew what she had to do. A secret journey. The next morning, she told her parents she wasn't feeling well and wanted to stay at the cabin while they went on a hike. They hesitated, exchanging concerned glances, but eventually agreed. As soon as the door shut behind them, Eleanor sprang into action. She grabbed her sketchbook, fastened Max's leash to his collar, and wheeled herself toward the trail leading back to the meadow. Her heart pounded as she maneuvered through the dense forest, her hands gripping the wheels of her chair tightly. Max stayed close, his ears perked, sensing the determination in her movements. The morning was crisp, the scent of pine thick in the air. Every crunch of gravel beneath her wheels sent a nervous thrill through her chest. She reached the clearing and held her breath. It was empty. Eleanor's stomach sank. Had she been wrong? Had the bear already moved on? A sharp gust of wind rustled the trees, sending leaves spiraling around her. And then, a sound. A low, deep huff. Her pulse leapt. From the shadows of the towering evergreens, the bear stepped forward. Eleanor's breath hitched. It was the same Grizzly. There was no mistaking it. Its golden-brown fur caught the dappled sunlight, its massive frame moving with deliberate grace. But it wasn't just its presence that struck her. It was the way it looked at her. Not as prey, not as a threat, but as something familiar. Max tensed but didn't bark. He sensed it too. The same unexplainable energy. Eleanor wheeled forward slowly. She was no longer afraid. The bear stopped just a few feet away, lowering itself to the ground. It was the same gesture as before, a silent acknowledgement. Her fingers trembled as she flipped open her sketchbook. She began to draw, capturing every detail of the bear. The powerful muscles beneath its thick coat. The way its dark eyes held an unreadable depth. With each stroke of her pencil, the connection between them deepened. It wasn't just a wild animal anymore. It was part of her, and she was part of it. She didn't know how much time passed. All she knew was that for those moments, nothing else existed. Just her, the bear, and the quiet understanding between them. Then, as if sensing she was done, the bear stood. It turned toward the trees, but hesitated at the edge, looking back one final time. Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. The bear let out a slow exhale, almost a sigh, before disappearing into the shadows. Tears pricked Eleanor's eyes. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know why fate had woven their paths together. But she knew this. The bear wasn't just an animal she had encountered by chance. It was her story, and she would never forget it. A part of the wild. By the time she returned to the cabin, her parents were already back, worry etched across their faces. "Eleanor," Margaret began, stepping toward her. "Where have you been?" Eleanor hesitated for a fraction of a second before pulling her sketchbook onto her lap and turning it toward them. John's breath caught as his eyes landed on the drawing. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth. "It was there," Eleanor said softly. "It came back." Her parents stared at her, their expressions unreadable. Then, finally, John let out a slow breath. "Eleanor." He knelt beside her, his voice quieter now. "I don't know if that bear remembers you. I don't know if it's the same one. But whatever it is, I believe that something is happening. Something we don't understand." Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening. "We just want you to be safe." Eleanor gave a small, determined smile. I am." She glanced down at her drawing, running her fingers over the lines. She had found something today. Not just a connection to the bear, but a connection to herself, to the world, to something bigger than she could explain. For now, that was enough. Margaret and John didn't press further. They simply wrapped their arms around their daughter, holding her close. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, carrying with it the unspoken memory of something wild and ancient. And in Eleanor's heart she knew this wasn't an ending. It was just the beginning. The visitor at the door, Eleanor Whitman's heart pounded as she stared at the massive silhouette outside the cabin door. The bear, the same bear, had returned, and this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, just barely visible in the dim porch light, 3 smaller shadows shifted in the snow. Cubs. Her father, John, stood frozen, his hand clenched around his phone. Her mother, Margaret, clutched Eleanor's shoulder, her face pale with fear. The cabin felt impossibly small, the air thick with tension. "We need to call the Rangers," John whispered, his voice tight. "No!" Eleanor's voice cracked as she grabbed his wrist. "Please don't. It's not here to hurt us." Her parents turned to her, confusion in their eyes. She felt the weight of her words pressing against the unshakable fear they had been taught to feel. But Eleanor knew. She knew in her bones that the bear meant no harm. Margaret's voice was soft but urgent. "Eleanor, honey, I know you feel connected to this bear, but we can't risk it. It has cubs. That makes it even more dangerous." Eleanor shook her head, her pulse racing. "It's not acting aggressively. If it wanted to hurt us, it would have already." She turned to her father, pleading with her eyes. "Dad, trust me." John hesitated, his fingers still hovering over his phone screen. He looked back at the bear, then at his daughter. He had always been cautious, always careful. But this was something different. Something beyond logic. Something beyond logic. Finally, he exhaled sharply and put the phone down. Eleanor didn't wait for permission. She wheeled herself toward the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Max, her golden retriever, let out a soft whimper but stayed at her side, sensing her determination. The bear didn't move, watching her through the glass. Eleanor reached for the door handle. Her mother sucked in a breath. "Eleanor!" She pulled it open. The cold night air rushed in, sending a shiver down her spine. She was face to face with the bear now, separated only by a few feet of frozen earth. Up close, it was even more magnificent. Its fur thick and golden, dusted with snow. Its breath curling into the night air in soft white clouds. The bear huffed quietly, lowering its head. A bow. Eleanor's throat tightened. She swallowed past the lump forming there and did the only thing that felt right. She bowed her head in return. The bear let out a deep, slow exhale. And then, to her astonishment, the 3 cubs peeked out from behind their mother, their small, curious eyes locked onto Eleanor. They were young, too young to be without their mother. Something about their presence made Eleanor's chest ache. Margaret and John stood frozen in the doorway, their expressions a mix of fear and awe. "Eleanor," her mother whispered, "what is happening?" Eleanor didn't know how to explain it. She only knew what she felt. She reached into her lap, fumbling with the pages of her sketchbook, and slowly held it up for the bear to see. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe she just wanted to show the bear that she understood. that she had seen her. The bear's eyes flicked to the drawing. A low rumbling sound vibrated in its chest. Not a growl, but something else. Something almost content. Eleanor felt the wind shift around her, as if the very air had changed. The connection between them, something deep, something ancient, solidified in that moment. Then, as quietly as it had come, the bear turned. It nudged one of the cubs forward with its nose, guiding them away from the cabin. Eleanor watched, breathless, as the small family disappeared into the trees. Silence stretched in the wake of their departure. Eleanor turned to her parents, her hands still gripping her sketchbook. "Do you believe me now?" Margaret wiped at the tears streaking her face. John ran a hand through his graying hair, shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't know what just happened," he admitted. "But I do know one thing." He looked at his daughter, his expression softening. "That bear knows you." The legacy of a moment the following morning. Eleanor sat on the porch, wrapped in a thick blanket, her sketchbook resting in her lap. The world felt different, quieter, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws. Her mother stepped outside, carrying 2 cups of tea. She handed one to Eleanor before sinking onto the porch swing beside her. "You okay?" Eleanor nodded. "I think so." Margaret took a sip of her tea, exhaling slowly. "You know, I used to think wild animals only saw humans as threats. But that bear, it wasn't afraid of you." Eleanor traced her fingers over the page of her sketchbook. "I don't think it ever was." Margaret hesitated before speaking again. "Do you think you'll see her again?" Eleanor thought about it. She thought about the quiet understanding in the bear's eyes, the way it had returned, the way it had bowed. She smiled softly. "I hope so." Her mother reached over, squeezing her hand. "I believe you, you know. You know, I don't understand it, but I believe you." Eleanor leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, warmth filling the space between them. Some stories didn't need perfect explanations. Some stories were meant to be felt, and Eleanor knew, deep in her heart, that this was one of them. The story that needed to be told. Eleanor Whitman took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the pages of her sketchbook. The room was packed, far more people than she had anticipated. Wildlife researchers, conservationists, families, and curious strangers had all gathered to hear her speak. The lights were warm against her face, but the memory she was about to share sent a shiver down her spine. She wasn't used to public speaking. She never imagined she'd be standing here, telling a story that had once belonged only to her, buried in the pages of her drawings. And yet, as she looked at the expectant faces in the audience, she knew she had to do this. She cleared her throat. "A few months ago," she began, her voice steady, "I met a grizzly bear." The murmurs in the crowd hushed. People leaned forward. But it wasn't just an ordinary encounter. Eleanor continued. "This bear didn't see me as prey or a threat. She approached me again and again with something else, something I can only describe as recognition." She flipped to a page in her sketchbook and held it up. It was the first drawing she had done of the bear, capturing its deep, intelligent eyes, the solemn way it had lowered its head toward her. "This bear," she said, "knew me before I even understood her." She took a slow breath, glancing at her parents in the front row. Margaret and John sat with their hands clasped together, their expressions a mixture of pride and wonder. It had taken time for them to fully grasp what had happened, but they had come to believe in it, just as she had. "I was always told that wild animals fear humans," Eleanor continued, "that they see us as threats, intruders in their world. But this bear didn't act out of fear or aggression. She came to me in the meadow. She returned to me outside my cabin and—" She paused, her voice catching for a moment. "She brought her cubs with her. She let me see them. Trust me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "This wasn't just chance," Eleanor said, gripping the podium. "It was something more. I don't know if she remembered me from my childhood, or if she sensed something in me that even I didn't understand. But what I do know is that these animals are more than what we've made them out to be. They aren't just predators. They aren't just statistics in conservation reports. They remember. They feel. And they trust." She turned another page in her sketchbook. This one showed the bear as she had last seen her, standing at the edge of the forest, looking back one final time. "I don't know if I'll ever see her again," Eleanor admitted, her voice softer now. "But I do know that I owe her something. She changed me. She showed me that our connection to nature isn't something distant. It's real. It's right in front of us if we just choose to see it." The audience was silent, absorbing her words. Eleanor smiled faintly. "And that's why I'm here today. I want to use my art and my story to remind people that we're not separate from these animals. We share this world with them, and it's up to us to make sure they still have a place in it." The room erupted into applause. Eleanor let out a shaky breath, overwhelmed by the response. She glanced at her parents again, her mother wiping away tears, her father nodding with a proud, knowing look in his eyes. After the event, people approached her, some asking questions, others simply wanting to tell her how much her story had moved them. A wildlife researcher invited her to an expedition in Yellowstone. A park ranger told her about a similar encounter he'd witnessed years ago. And a young girl holding a sketchbook just like Eleanor's looked up at her with wide, hopeful eyes. "I want to draw animals like you do," the girl said. "I want to understand them." Eleanor knelt down to meet the girl's gaze, smiling. "Then keep drawing," she said, "and keep listening. You never know when the world might have something to say." As she left the event that night, Eleanor felt lighter. She had come here thinking she was telling her story. But maybe it wasn't just her story. Maybe it belonged to something bigger. To the bear. To the wilderness. To every person willing to open their heart to the world beyond their own. And somewhere, deep in the wild, she hoped that the bear, her bear, was standing beneath the stars, knowing that she, too, would never forget. Lessons from the Wild. A reflection on life and connection. Eleanor Whitman's story of the grizzly bear was more than an extraordinary encounter. It was a testament to something deeper, something that applies to all of us. In an age where technology and modern distractions pull us further from the natural world, her experience reminds us that our connection to nature is not lost, only forgotten. The bear, with its quiet trust and presence, became a symbol of something larger than itself, of resilience, understanding, and the power of unspoken bonds. In many ways, Eleanor's journey mirrors our own search for meaning, trust, and the courage to embrace the unknown. In life, we often move through the world consumed by fear, uncertainty, or hesitation. We build walls, not just between ourselves and others, but between ourselves and the world around us. The bear's presence challenged that idea. It didn't come to Eleanor with aggression or fear. It came with curiosity, trust, and an unexplainable recognition. How often do we allow ourselves to truly see and be seen? To connect without barriers, without assumptions? Eleanor could have reacted with panic, like the others in the park. Instead, she chose to listen, to observe with an open heart. That choice changed everything. Her story also speaks to the importance of trust. Not just in others, but in ourselves. Eleanor felt an instinctual pull toward the bear, a connection she couldn't fully explain. Many of us ignore those instincts, pushing aside what feels true in favor of what seems logical or safe. But had Eleanor not trusted herself, she would have missed out on one of the most profound experiences of her life. This is a lesson we can all carry. Sometimes, the path forward isn't clear, But if we listen to ourselves, to the world, to the quiet moments where meaning exists, we might just find exactly what we need. Beyond personal connection, the bear's story reminds us of our responsibility. Nature is not separate from us. It is intertwined with our lives in ways we don't always recognize. The grizzly trusted Eleanor, and in return, she took on the role of protector, not just for that bear, but for all wildlife. In the same way, we have a duty to care for the world around us. Conservation isn't just about saving animals. It's about preserving the balance of life, about ensuring future generations can witness the same beauty and wonder. It's about understanding that every action we take, no matter how small, can contribute to something greater. Eleanor's experience didn't end when the bear disappeared into the forest. It lived on in her art, in the stories she shared, and in the way she chose to move forward. That's the final lesson we take from her journey. True impact isn't about a single moment, but about what we do with it. Whether through creativity, advocacy, or simple acts of kindness, we all have the power to carry something meaningful into the world. Eleanor's story became a force for change, reminding people that the wild isn't just something out there, it's something within us all. As she whispered her quiet thank you to the stars, she wasn't just speaking to the bear. She was speaking to the lessons, the moments, the memories that had shaped her. And perhaps, in the depths of the wilderness, the bear heard her too. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of resilience, hope, and the unbreakable spirit of life. See you in the next story.